and look at that and help you.
I'm happy. I appreciate
Again, we're
that.
doing everything we can.
Okay, but let me just ask you, when
Finest people I know in terms
I was
of
asking,
And I don't like getting into looks. You know, looks don't mean anything, right? You look at Pam, I would never say she's beautiful because that'd be the end of my political career.
It's fundamentally unfair to every working person whose taxes come straight out of their paycheck.
Over $1 billion, 0 cents. 4,725 wire transfers. Hidden away in a secret government file, these are the chilling numbers that tie Jeffrey Epstein to an international network of abuse, corruption, and silence.
Multiple homes, a mansion in the Dominican, multi-million dollar homes in Florida, a horse farm valued at millions of dollars, cars, 9 vehicles, I believe, jewelry, millions of dollars in jewelry and cash.
So yes, you must comply. You must give the information to our ICE, to our Homeland Security officers.
Our amendment, this bipartisan amendment, ought to be accepted when the author of the underlying provision has said publicly he will vote for it if the Senate gets a chance to vote, as Senator Toomey and I have indicated.
For years, the truth has been locked away, deliberately ignored by those in power. The victims? Silent. Their stories buried. The perpetrators? Shielded. What's inside this file could change everything, but it remains hidden. Why? The truth is waiting to be uncovered, and it's time to demand answers. The question is, how much longer will we let this silence continue? This Treasury file contains hard data, not hearsay or conjecture. The documents are the result of years of investigation into Epstein's operations, and what they reveal is a troubling narrative of financial flows that seem to stretch across borders, involving powerful institutions and individuals. But despite the substantial numbers in the file, the question remains, why has this information been kept under wraps for so long? For years, the American public has been denied access to the details contained in this file, and there's been significant resistance to any attempts to make it public. This is not a case of hidden documents being the result of political missteps or simple negligence. This is an example of deliberate opacity at the highest levels. When Senator Wyden made his call for transparency, he was advocating for public access to hard facts that could potentially unravel a much larger story. Epstein's financial network was anything but small. According to the Treasury file, the vast sum of $1.1 billion 0 cents was funneled through just one of his bank accounts, processed through 4,725 separate wire transfers. That's over 4,000 potential lines of investigation, each of them a clue waiting to be followed. The implications of these numbers go far beyond a single man's wealth. They point to a well-organized network, one that could involve multiple criminal activities spanning across multiple jurisdictions. The transfers didn't just happen in isolation. A significant portion of the money moved through Russian banks, some of which are now under international sanctions. These institutions have long been associated with corruption, secrecy, and connections to hostile networks. So why was Epstein, a man already exposed as a predator, using these financial institutions to process large sums of money? Why did so many of his victims come from countries like Russia, Belarus, and Turkey, nations consistently flagged for human trafficking activities? The connection between these financial transactions and the international sex trafficking network Epstein was involved in is hard to ignore. The movement of funds and the movement of women and girls appear to be linked. Victims pulled into Epstein's world were not simply passing through, they were part of an international pipeline. These connections raise serious questions about the kind of people who may have been involved in trafficking these victims, as well as the organizations that may have been complicit in Epstein's operations. This is where the investigation must begin. The Department of Justice should be following up on these leads, examining the financial transactions in detail, and investigating who else might have been involved in Epstein's network. Whedon's call for transparency is not just about exposing one man's wrongdoing. It's about digging into a system that may have enabled decades of international sex trafficking. This is not just about speculation. It's about hard evidence and an urgent need for accountability. However, the response from authorities has been disheartening, to say the least. Attorney General Pam Bondi, at the time serving under the Trump administration, dismissed any further investigation into Epstein's actions, calling the claims ludicrous. This was despite the evidence in the Treasury file that pointed to massive financial flows tied to Epstein, some of which likely contributed to his illegal activities. The attitude of the Trump administration at the time was one of complete denial. Even as the Senate Finance Committee and other agencies pushed for greater transparency, the Treasury Department's response was one of dismissal. When Senator Wyden formally requested the Epstein file, the Treasury responded with a letter that, while polite, essentially told him to stop asking for more information. In Washington, this kind of response is often referred to as a polite bureaucratic rebuff, one that says, "You've got all the information you need, now stop asking." This approach is not an isolated incident. It's part of a larger pattern of secrecy and resistance to full transparency, especially when powerful figures and institutions are involved. The same people who pledged to bring about transparency and accountability during their campaigns seemed to backtrack when it came time to address real issues of corruption and abuse. Instead of allowing investigators to examine the full scope of Epstein's financial dealings, the response from officials was a stone wall of silence. The actions of Pam Bondi in particular are troubling. As the Attorney General of Florida, she had a clear understanding of the severity of Epstein's crimes, many of which took place in her own state. She had both the context and the authority to demand further action on the national stage, yet she chose to remain silent. Instead of pushing for further investigation, she stood by those who preferred secrecy over justice. This failure of leadership is not just a personal shortcoming, it reflects a broader systemic failure to hold powerful figures accountable. In the face of all this resistance, Senator Wyden continues to demand transparency. His call is simple but crucial. Release the full Treasury file to Congress. This is not about summarized documents or selectively redacted pages. It's about access to the full, unfiltered information, because when you follow the money, you follow the truth. And right now, that truth remains hidden, locked away in a government cabinet, beyond the reach of the public. The question that remains is why? Why is there such resistance to exposing these details? Why is the full file not being made available for scrutiny? These questions need to be answered because the truth cannot remain buried forever. If there is to be any hope for justice for Epstein's victims, if there is to be any accountability for those who enabled him, the first step is transparency. The American people deserve to know the truth, and that truth is locked inside a cabinet in the Treasury Department. The refusal to release the full Epstein file raises serious questions about the integrity of the system meant to protect the public and uphold the law. The bureaucratic resistance to Senator Wyden's request for transparency is not just a minor inconvenience. It's a deliberate strategy to prevent the truth from coming to light. When the Treasury Department, under the Trump administration, issued a letter in response to the senator's multiple requests, it was a classic example of a stonewalling tactic that is often used to delay or deflect serious investigations. The letter, while polite, essentially told Whedon that he had already received all the information he needed. In other words, stop asking. It was a coded response, signaling that no more information would be provided and that the status quo would remain unchallenged. This refusal to provide the full file to Congress is more than just an issue of political inconvenience. It is a reflection of the entrenched power structures that operate within the highest levels of government. Epstein's case is not an isolated incident. It is part of a larger pattern of how elites and the powerful are often shielded from accountability. In Washington, when the powerful are involved, transparency becomes a scarce commodity. Bureaucracies designed to serve the public often shift to serve the interests of those with the most power, wealth, and influence. This kind of resistance isn't new. For years, various branches of government have fought efforts to shed light on Epstein's financial activities, and the same bureaucratic games are still being played. Despite mounting evidence that Epstein's network was vast and involved high-level corruption, the response from government agencies has been one of resistance and evasion. It's as if there is an unwillingness to confront the full scope of Epstein's criminal activities because doing so would expose too many uncomfortable truths. For the system to function properly, there must be transparency. When that transparency is denied, it sends a dangerous message that justice is not for the powerful, and that certain people and entities can operate above the law. One of the most troubling aspects of this case is the role of Pam Bondi, the former Attorney General of Florida, who was in a unique position to push for accountability due to the fact that many of Epstein's crimes took place in her state. Bondi had the authority and responsibility to demand an investigation into Epstein's financial dealings and the potential involvement of other high-level figures. However, instead of leading the charge for justice, Bondi chose silence. This was not just a failure to act. It was a choice to stand by those who would prefer that Epstein's crimes remain hidden. The decision to remain silent when the public demanded answers is not just a political failure, it's a moral one. Bondi's failure to act when she had the opportunity is indicative of a broader systemic issue within the justice system. Epstein's case is not just about one man's depravity, it's about how the system bends to protect the wealthy and powerful. When those with influence are implicated in wrongdoing, the very institutions that are supposed to hold them accountable often fail to do so. Whether it's the Department of Justice, the Treasury Department, or other government agencies, the response to Epstein's actions has been lackluster, with too many officials either choosing not to pursue the truth or actively working to keep it hidden. This is where the system shows its cracks. The powerful are protected, while the victims are left to suffer in silence. The scale of the financial activities revealed by the Treasury file cannot be overstated. Nearly $1.1 billion moved through Epstein's accounts, with over 4,700 separate wire transfers. This was not just money being shuffled around quietly. This was a massive financial network at work. The volume and complexity of these transactions are indicative of something much larger than one individual's wealth. Epstein wasn't simply a wealthy man indulging his own desires. He was part of a much larger criminal operation, one that spanned multiple countries and involved multiple high-level individuals and institutions. The money didn't just flow through traditional banking systems, it passed through Russian banks that were known to be under sanctions for corruption and ties to hostile networks. These are not the kind of financial institutions that an innocent man would use for legitimate transactions. The very nature of these transactions points to a well-organized criminal operation that reached far beyond Epstein himself. As disturbing as these financial transactions are, they are only part of the story. The real question is what happens next? If the full file were released and the financial trail were followed, what would investigators uncover? The reality is that there are likely more names, more connections, and more victims buried in those documents. The file represents not just a collection of numbers. It represents a potential roadmap to uncovering the full extent of the trafficking operation that Epstein ran. But until that information is made available to the public and fully investigated, these questions will remain unanswered. The resistance to transparency is not just an inconvenience, it's a deliberate effort to prevent the truth from being known. The powerful and wealthy have long used their influence to evade scrutiny, and Epstein's case is no different. The Treasury Department, along with other government agencies, has actively worked to prevent the release of information that could potentially expose those who helped Epstein operate his criminal network. And the fact that these documents are still being withheld is a clear indication that there are still powerful forces at play trying to protect those involved. This resistance has a profound impact on the survivors of Epstein's abuse. Every day that the file remains locked away, every day that the truth is hidden, the survivors are denied justice. They are left to watch as the system fails them. as the people who enabled their abuse continue to walk free. It's not just a failure of the justice system, it's a betrayal of the very people it is supposed to protect. The survivors are left with no answers, no accountability, and no closure. Their stories are ignored, their pain is dismissed, and the abusers who destroyed their lives continue to evade justice. The message that is being sent to the public is clear. If you are powerful enough, if you have enough money and influence, the system will protect you. The rules don't apply to everyone equally. For the survivors, this message is not just frustrating, it's devastating. It tells them that no matter how much they've suffered, no matter how many years of abuse they endured, their pain doesn't matter in the face of wealth and power. That is a dangerous precedent to set because it undermines the very idea of justice and equality under the law. Senator Wyden's call for the release of the full Epstein file is not just about one man or one case. It's about ensuring that the truth comes to light and that justice is done for all the victims. The financial records are key to understanding the full scope of Epstein's crimes and the network that enabled him to operate with impunity for so long. But as long as these records are kept hidden, as long as the government continues to stonewall, the truth will remain locked away, and the survivors will be left without the justice they deserve. The fight for transparency is not over. Senator Wyden has made it clear that he will continue to press for the release of the full file, but he cannot do it alone. The American public must demand action. If enough people continue to push for answers, if enough voices demand that the truth be exposed, then the file may finally be released and the full extent of Epstein's crimes can be uncovered. But without that pressure, without public outrage, the file will remain locked away and those who were involved will continue to evade accountability. The question that remains is whether we will allow this truth to be buried forever or whether we will demand the transparency and justice that the survivors so desperately need. When you follow the money, you follow the truth, and the truth is still locked inside that cabinet. The real question is how much longer we will allow it to stay there.